in crowds to lay them down.
Shalom, shalom, la'am, la Yhuh, ani shalomah, through the Rabbah la Shema, that is greetings, people of Yhuh, I'm shalomah. Thank you for listening. I certainly appreciate your time. I know it's been a while since the last one was released, so I want to apologize for that. Life be lifing, as they say, but we're here, and so we're going to continue picking up in our series. This is part 3 of our series, an investigative look, a closer look at Paul. If you have not caught the first 2 sessions and teachings, I encourage you to go back and do so, lay some pretty solid groundwork that will help us to be able to better receive this particular lesson here. So I'll plead with you, go back and catch those first 2 if you have not done so already. Y'all know I don't like long introductions, but I do feel the need to do a little tiny recap here. And to answer the question, why are we even looking at Paul again, right? He's already been solidified, right? Well, that's a presupposition. And that's that filter that I talked about that we have to remove. We're taking another look at him because if you're like me, most of us here are, you have been called out of churchianity, you've been called out of Christianity. And in doing so, it has required you to take another look at some of the teachings and beliefs that you held to. And in doing that, you find out there's some things that, we believe that we held to that just don't line up with the scriptures. And so we've had to change, our beliefs and change our stances on certain things. And for me personally, as I begin to look at covenants again and how they work, and specifically how our deliverance is inside of covenant, there is no deliverance outside of a covenant with the Most High. And I began to look at Paul's understanding of how deliverance and covenants worked. Some things weren't lining up for me. And so I had to go all the way back and start at the beginning with Paul and ask the Most High, please remove that presupposition filter. And let me just look at the text and reveal, what the text says and what I am to believe about Paul and his writings, right? And so that's why we're here now where we are. And so we're going to get back to it. And today we're looking at Paul's conversion testimony. Now, I know you may think, hey, that's nitpicking. You can really look at anybody's testimony and find fault and error in any of those things. And of course you can. But by the time we finish with this, I believe there are going to be some greater implications that come about as we look at some of these aspects of his testimony. And so we're going to begin looking at, did Paul claim to have seen the resurrected Yahusha? Here we are. That's the question I have. Did he claim to have seen the resurrected Yahusha? Let's look at 1 Corinthians 9 and 1 Corinthians 15. And this is a letter that was written by Paul's own hand. Remember, we talked about earlier how there are some things that Paul wrote by his own hand. And then there are some things that have been written by others, perhaps using the name of Paul, or things written about Paul that he did not write himself, right? So this is written by his own hand. And he says here in 1 Corinthians 9:1, am I not an emissary? Another word for apostle. Am I not free? Have I not seen Yahushua, Messiah, our master? Are you not my work in the master? So he says, a rhetorical question. Have I not seen Yahushua, our master? Obviously, he must have told him that he has. And so he just, asking him again, haven't I seen him? And then in the same book here, chapter 15, verse 8, he says, and last of all, he was seen by me also, as if to one born prematurely. That's an interesting statement. But he said, at last he was seen by me. So he said, the emissary saw him, Jacob saw him, Kepha saw him, all of them saw him. But guess what? I saw him too, right? But I saw him as one being born prematurely, right? I'm going to get back to that statement here, but we'll leave it right there for now. And then you have some other instances. These are more visionary experiences, which we're definitely going to talk about. But in Acts 22:18, he says, and I saw him saying to me. And in Acts 23:11, he says, and on the following night, the Adun stood by him and said, right? And then in Acts 9:27, Barnabas, who is vouching for Shaul, he says that, Shaul told him, obviously, that he saw Yahusha. And so to answer the question, did Paul claim to have seen him? Absolutely. He claimed to have seen the resurrected Yahusha. But where did he see him? When did he see him? Well, according to, the reports that we have, the only reports that we have is his sighting on the road to Damascus. And so we're going to look at that sighting on the road to Damascus. But interestingly enough to mention here is, let me look at Galatians. I'm going to pull Galatians up. But Paul himself never actually writes about his Damascus Road experience. And as central and vital to his entire ministry and life and his teachings and everything is the Damascus Road experience. He himself actually never writes about it. Matter of fact, he says in Galatians chapter 1 look at verse number 15. But when it pleased Elohim, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his favor to reveal his bond or his son in me, that I might bring him the good news to the Gentiles. Notice, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood. Neither did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were emissaries before me, but I went to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. So Shaul say, listen, we take it that this revealing of his bond or his son in me is, that Damascus Road experience. He says, after that, I didn't immediately consult with anybody. I didn't tell anybody any details about it. I just went to Arabia and then came back. Right. So that's as much as we have from Shaul when it comes to details about this Damascus Road experience, which means we must depend on Luke. Now, Luke is a reporter, and according to Luke, he gets his information from eyewitnesses or those who knew eyewitnesses, and he just gets information and reports it as is. And you're going to see what I mean when I say that. But let's read Acts chapter number 9. This is Luke's writing. And the same story is told in Acts 22 and 26. We're not going to read all of those, but we'll read Acts 9 just to refamiliarize ourselves with the experience of Paul here. And it says in verse number 3, and it came to be that as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light flashed around him from the Shamaim. And he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Shaul, Shaul, why do you persecute me? And he said, who are you, Adoni? And the Adon said, I am Yhuh, whom you persecute. It is hard for you to kick against the prods. Both trembling and being astonished, he said, Adoni, what do you want me to do? And the Adon said to him, arise and go into the city, and you shall be told what you have to do. And the men journeying with him stood speechless, hearing indeed the voice, but seeing no one. And Shaul arose from the ground, but when his eyes were open, he saw no one. And leading him by the hand, they brought him to Damascus. So that's the story, just in case we need to refamiliarize ourselves with it. But what I'm going to do here for the next couple moments is I'm going to point out some key inconsistencies and may I say even contradictions. And again, not just nitpicking, but these inconsistencies and contradictions have greater implications than just, inconsistencies, right? And we're going to start in Acts chapter number 9. And notice here in verse number 7. And it says, and the men journeying with him stood speechless. Notice, hearing indeed the voice, but seeing no one. The word indeed is added there. Other translations just have hearing the voice. But make no mistake about it. They supposedly heard the voice, the men that were traveling with him. They heard the voice. When we get to Acts chapter number 22, this is the exact same event being testified here before Felix, right? In Acts 22, the report that Luke is giving, here's the story. It says, and those who were with me, talking about Shaul, indeed saw the light and were afraid. But notice, but they did not hear his voice speaking to me. I'm pretty sure you caught it. Acts chapter 9 says they heard the voice. Acts 22 says they did not hear the voice. These statements cannot be mutually exclusive because they are talking about the exact same event. But they clearly are contrary statements, meaning that either one is true and one is false, or either they both are false, but they both cannot be true because they're talking about the same event in their contrary statements. And I've seen attempts to reconcile this passage in Acts chapter 22 by translating this word here to they did not understand the voice, right? So I want to look at the word that's used in Acts chapter 22 and Acts chapter number 9. And notice here, let's get our concordance out. It says, it is G191. You see that? It says, hearing a voice, but seeing no man. It's G191. That's the word. I'm not going to try to pronounce the Greek. Just want you to see that this is the word that is used. Look at Acts chapter 22 and verse 9. Let's see which word is used there. It says, they were afraid, but they heard not the voice. And notice the word that's used. The exact same word, G191, right? So you say, why would they translate that to understand? what gives them the license or the liberty to mistranslate that, I believe, to the word understand. The context does not suggest that that word should be translated any differently in Acts 22 than it is in Acts chapter number 9, because it's talking about the exact same event. So there should be no liberty to retranslate that word. The reason that that word is translated is because there's that presupposition, that filter that I talked about, where you have to translate this word a specific way in order to fit that bias. Because if you don't, then it throws off the testimony. Furthermore, when you look at Acts chapter 26, verse 14, let's look here, verse 14. It says this. I'll put the Yah scriptures. In verse 14, same event being rehearsed again. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Abari language, or commonly known as Hebrew. Why is that important? According to this report, that voice spoke in the tongue that would have been native to Shaul, but it would also have been native to those who were traveling with him. Remember, Shaul is a Pharisee. That's to his own admission. He's a Pharisee. And we know in the culture of Yashara'al, especially reading through Shaul's writings, that Gentiles and Yashara'al, they didn't travel together. They despised Gentiles to some degree for the most part. And so certainly Shaul was not going to be traveling to go kill some Yashara'al with some Gentiles. He would have been traveling with other of those who are of Yashara'al. They would have also understood the Abari language. So to translate this word in Acts 22 as they did not understand is a mistranslation, and I believe it's based on that presupposition. And they should not have taken the license to translate that word in some translations as they did not understand the voice. So the point being made is this is a clear contradiction. So what do we conclude? Well, we conclude two things. Number one, we no longer have a verifiable witness and a reliable witness outside of Paul's reported, that he heard a voice. We have no witnesses to that voice. So we don't know if the men heard it or they did not hear it, right? You say, oh, so what? Does that mean just because, we have a difference in details there that the event didn't happen? No, not necessarily. But the greater implication, number two, is this. Since these passages are contrary one to another, if we see it that way, how then can we continue to hold these passages as scripture? We know the word of Yhuh and scripture does not contradict. According to Ta'alim, Psalm 19, every word is pure, is true, is clean. Scripture does not contradict one another. These are clearly contradictory statements. So the question is, how then can we continue to hold these passages as scripture? Now, coincidentally or uncoincidentally, it happens to be talking about Paul. Confusion again surrounding Paul. So that's the greater implication. Again, that's why we're looking at Paul's testimony, because these type of things lead to other questions that are much, of much greater impact than just, an inconsistency in testimony. All right. So let's look at the second one. I won't spend a lot of time on it because it's not a huge deal. To some, it may not be, but it's worth mentioning. And it's found, it's talking about when Paul was told what his purpose was. In Acts chapter 9, verse 6, it says this: both trembling and being astonished, he said, Master, what do you wish me to do? And the master said to him, Arise and go into the city, and you shall be told what you have to do. And as you continue to read more of that passage, that's exactly what he does. He's led into Damascus. 3 days he's blind. Hananiah comes, lays his hand on him. He's supposed to receive Ruach HaKodesh, and there is what he's told what he's supposed to do in the city of Damascus. Here in Acts chapter 22, it's the same thing, right? I won't read it all. I'll just read the last part here. But here Hananiah comes, and after Hananiah comes, he gives him his purpose. He tells him, because you shall be his witness to all men of what you have seen and heard, right? So, same thing. Acts 22, goes into the city. Hananiah tells him what he's supposed to be doing. But in Acts chapter 26, as he's before the sovereign Agrippa, it changes a little bit. And he says here, matter of fact, let me go back because I want to add some context here. I'm starting in look at verse number 13. At midday, O sovereign, I saw a light from the Shamayim, brighter than the sun, shining around me and those who journey with me. And when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Abari language, Shaul, why do you persecute me? It is hard for you to kick against the prods. Look at verse number 16. He says, but rise up and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to appoint you a servant and a witness, both of what you saw and of those things which I shall reveal to you, delivering you from the people and the Gentiles to whom I now send you, to open their eyes to turn them from darkness to light and the authority of Hashatan to Elohim, in order for them to receive forgiveness of sins and an inheritance among those who are Kadosh by belief in me. Right? So it would seem to me that in Acts 9 and Acts 22, he has to go into the city, and that's where he finds out that he's supposed to be a witness to the Gentiles. However, in Acts chapter 26, it's right there on the road to Damascus. The voice is the one that's telling him, this is what you ought to do. You are to be a witness to the Gentiles. So which is it, Shaul? Is it Hananiah told you your purpose in the city? Or did that voice tell you your purpose right there on the road to Damascus? You say, once again, so what? What's the big deal? You know, it doesn't matter who told him. It matters what he was told, right? You know, to some degree, sure. But imagine us being on the witness stand, and day 1 and day 2, you say, such and such told me this. But day 3, you say, no, another person told me this. Your testimony would automatically be put into question. Well, which is it? He told you or he told you? And because we can't figure out who told you, then how can we trust what was told to you, right? That would be the question if a person was on the witness stand. And so, again, that's a question mark and another inconsistency that we see in Paul's testimony, right? And again, we'll make a great big deal out of that one, but it was worthy enough to mention. But the last one I want to make, here is, to me, is a greater deal. And the reason it's a greater deal is because it has to do with who Paul actually saw on that road to Damascus. According to Paul in 1 Corinthians, he said, I saw Yhuh HaMashiach. And that's all he says. Doesn't give any detail about it, as mentioned before. So when we look at the details of that, supposed sighting, these are the details. Notice with me in Acts chapter number 9. And let's see here. Let's go back to verse number 8. This is who Shaul saw according to Luke and whoever his sources were. Now, we suppose that one of Luke's sources was Shaul, but clearly he must have other sources because of the differencing and the inconsistencies in testimony. But according to Luke in Acts 9, he says, and Shaul arose from the ground, but when his eyes were opened, he saw no one. So first we have this blinding light, first and foremost. They saw the light. Make no mistake about that. They saw light. But then Shaul has to close his eyes. Obviously, while his eyes are closed, he's not seeing anybody. The light was so bright that he couldn't see anybody. And then finally says when he opened his eyes, he saw no one, right? In Acts chapter 22, in verse number 6, it says, and it came to be as I was journeying and coming near Damascus about noon, suddenly a great light shone round me out of the Shamayim. So once again, what did Shaul see? He saw a great light. That's what he saw. He just saw a light. We look down in Acts chapter 22. Here it is. And those who were with me indeed saw the light. So they all saw the light, right? Just to kind of reiterate that. But in Acts chapter 26, look at verse number 19. Therefore, sovereign Agrippas, I was not disobedient to the vision of the Shamayim, the vision of the Shamayim. Remember I talked about earlier those visionary experiences that Shaul had when he said, and the doom stood by me and I saw him standing by me saying, well, here in Acts chapter 26, according to Luke, what Shaul had wasn't a physical and personal encounter and sighting of Yahushua. Supposedly, he had a heavenly vision. Here it is, bright light, boom, it's blinding. Eyes got to be closed. And so now he's just hearing this voice with his eyes closed and this bright light that has knocked him down on the ground. And it's a heavenly vision and heavy experience. And he hears his voice. And when he opens his eyes, nobody's there. Sees no one. So we question, Shaul, who did you really see on the road to Damascus? Because according to the report from Luke, you just saw a light and then you saw no one, no body, no figure, no nail prints and hands, nothing. We assume it was Yahushua according to the report because of what the voice said, but interestingly enough, and I thought this is worth mentioning, the voice just said, I'm Yahushua or I'm Yahushua of Nazareth. Never identified himself or itself as Yahushua HaMashiach, the anointed one, just Yahushua. Yhuh is a common name in Yashara'al. It's like Joshua. That's the correct transliteration if you're going to transliterate it, which we don't need to. It's just like saying John, Joey in English. It's a common name in Yashara'al, and it never identifies itself as Hamashiach, the anointed one. It just says Yhuh. So, listen to me closely, and we're getting ready to wrap up here, but listen to me closely, please. Shaul never met in the flesh Yhuh HaMashiach, according to the text. Never met him in the flesh. What Shaul had was this heavenly vision with his eyes closed after seeing his great light and supposedly hearing this voice that we have no verifiable, reliable witnesses outside of what is being reported by Luke that Paul said, but everybody else who's around him, we can't verify if they heard the voice or not. Based on these writings and reports of this vision that Shaul has, back in Corinthians, he says, I saw him as one being born prematurely. What does that even mean? It means like I saw him before I was supposed to see him. Because according to Yahushai's own words, when he went to his father, no one was going to see him. Let's look at that real quick. This is what Yahushai says. He says, look in Yhuh, chapter 14, verse 19. Yet a little while, and the world no longer sees me. But you shall see me because I live and you shall live. Now, if you read the rest of the chapter, you know he's talking about they're going to see him at the first resurrection. That's when he's talking about you're going to see him. But before then, nobody's going to see him. The entire world. There are no exceptions to that. Yhuh 16:10, he says, concerning righteousness, because I go to my Father and you see me no more. Yhushua said, when I go to my Father, when I sinned, which is what he did in Acts chapter 1, verse 8, he said, when I sinned, he said, no one's going to see me anymore, right? But Shaul somehow saw him as one being born prematurely, like I saw him almost before everybody else type of thing, right? But he saw him in a vision. So what do we conclude? This is what we conclude. We have no verifiable, reliable witnesses to what really happened on that road to Damascus, because the witness accounts that we have, they're inconsistent and they're contrary. Number two, we have an entire religion, I believe, based off of one man's visionary experience and him hearing a voice. Think about that. A worldwide religion based on one man's vision and hearing of a voice from the Shamayim. Doesn't that sound familiar? I can name at least 2 to 3 religions that all started the exact same way. Somebody heard a voice, somebody had this heavenly vision, and all of a sudden they got this new revelation and new doctrines that they're spreading across the world. That's what Christianity really is. And the reason it's so hard to see it that way is because the founder, the starter of Christianity, yes, I believe he was the founder and starter of Christianity, he was well-versed. May I say, matter of fact, he had a degree in the Torah. He learned under Gamaliel. He was supposedly Yashara'al, but he had a degree in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew scriptures, because he was a Pharisee. So he knew the Hebrew scriptures well. He knew Torah very well. And so he took his knowledge and he coupled it with this experience. And now he believes he has this new revelation. And because of his background in the Tanakh and the Torah, there's so many similarities in his teachings in Christianity as there are to the way of Yhuh. There's similarities, but there are also some great differences. And people get so caught up with the similarities, they say that Christianity cannot be, have any falsehoods in it because, of the similarities. But what about the differences? That's what we're focusing on, the differences. And so that's how I view Shaul. You say throw away all Shaul. No, not necessarily, but you have to read it with discretion of the Ruach HaKodesh, because there are some similarities because of who he is and his background. But it's the differences that we must reconcile. If we can't reconcile them, then we cannot count them as scripture. And how can we continue to count Shaul as an apostle, which we're going to get to in our next video because of his non-physical sighting of Yhuh HaMashiach. Does he still qualify to be an emissary? And then we'll start looking at his teachings as well. So I'm going to stop there. If you found any insight, any new knowledge or anything that has been helpful to you, and others who are looking for the same, please share this, subscribe, and tune in next time as we continue to look at Paul at a closer look as well. And until next time, learn the word, live the word, and share the word shalom.
I am chasing Christ.